Good evening, friends. I'm KK Muhammad, the former Regional Director, Archaeological Survey of India. First of all, let me heartily congratulate the group Adventures in Archaeology for organizing a lecture series of this kind during the lockdown period. And I especially congratulate them for the title, that is Adventures in Archaeology. Actually, archaeology itself is a very adventurous game and also an adventurous discipline. And if you want to see the kind of adventures in archaeology, you have to come with me to Bateshwar. Bateshwar is in Chambal Valley, where we have conserved near about 80 temples with the help of the Chambal dacoits. So that is the real kind of adventures. Even otherwise also, archaeology is full of adventures. But today, we are not going to speak about adventures in archaeology. I had taken up the topic of Buddhism and especially the early Buddhism and the archaeological excavations of this early Buddhist cultures, sites in UP and Bihar. We all know Mahatma Buddha. He was born almost, in 565, which means 6th century BC. 6th century BC, is a very unusual period in the history of mankind. Like 16th century Renaissance period, Reformation period. This was in 6th century BC, this was a Reformation and Renaissance period. All over the world, we have some great personalities. For example, in Greek, we have Pythagoras. In China, Confucius and Lao Tse. In Persia, Zoroaster. In Jerusalem, we have Bahamiya, Isaiah, and many other prophets. And of course, in India, two very great persons, Mahavir Jain and Mahatma Buddha. The great historian and philosopher Karl Jasper has called this particular period of 6th century up to 3rd century BC as axial age. Axial age means in a very particular period of time, we have some greatest personalities who have influenced the entire world till this time. The philosophy of Mahatma Buddha, Mahavir Jain, or even Confucius, Lao Tse, Zoroaster, all those people are even now relevant. So that is why it is known as axial history. And coming back to Buddhism, we know, and especially Buddha, we know that he was born in an area known as Kapilavastu as the son of Shuddhodana. He saw few incidents in his life. He saw certain things: an old man, a sick man, a dead corpse, and then the bright face of a monk or a sannyasi. This sannyasi, he had nothing, but he was very happy. Still, why he is happy while others are not happy? This question was wrangling in the mind of Lord Buddha also. So he went and asked him, "You have nothing of your own, and why you are so happy?" So he says, Narapungava Janma Mrityu Bitaha Shamana Pravarsidosmi Mokshahedu. Oh, the great human being, I just wanted to get out of the shackles of life and death, life and death, life and death. I just wanted to get out of the chain of this life and death, life and death. And for that, I have left the world. I don't want to be here in this world. That is why I'm so happy. Then he goes to, I mean, we all know that the Mahabir Nishkramana, he goes out of his own house, even after having a child, goes to many people, many teachers, many friends. He was not satisfied. Ultimately, he gets Bodhodaya and then he goes to Sarnath. He preaches them. These are the history part of Lord Buddha. And after Buddha, his program and his philosophy that was propagated by Ashoka. So what Buddha was doing was actually he was at that time in 6th century BC. Caste system had become very powerful. The whole society was within the clutches of the caste system. The Brahmanas, the Kshatriyas, the upper caste, the Vaishyas and Shudras also, and Shudras were at the lowest part of the caste system. We find a small reference about this caste system in Rig Veda. Brahmasyo mukham asit bahu rajanya kride uru tad asye yad vaishye padayom shudra ajayate. So the shudra has come out of his own feet. So that was the thing. But at that time, it was not very rigid. There was even marriages also, anuloma, pradiloma marriages were also there. In later Vedic period, it was not very, I mean, rigid at that time. But at later period, it became very rigid. Shudra Makshara Samyukta Dhurata Parivarje. The literate Shudra, he should be kept away. He should be kept away. That was the instruction. So this kind of things were going on, but Bhagavad Gita, when it came, Bhagavad Gita tried to balance the whole thing. Bhagavad Gita said, no, it is not like that. Chadurvarnyam Maya Srishtam. Chadurvarnya has been created by God, but that makes a condition. Guna Karma Vibhagasha. It is just based on the karma which a man is not doing, when a man is doing. But even that also could not stop the rigidity of the caste system. It became very rigid. And Mahatma Buddha had to fight against this one also, this caste system also. But he did not fight it directly. He fought it indirectly by having a number of educational institutions. And the great Nalanda University, the Nalanda institution was one of them. So he did not have it in Rajgir because Rajgir was the capital. So he did not have that educational institution in Rajgir. Instead, he went out of the city and there he made this institution so that it should not be within the stranglehold of the Brahmanas. So he made a city, he just went out of it and there he made a small institution during his lifetime itself. Then later on, it became very big and very big. And we know that some of the greatest Western universities, they came up in 12th century, especially the Paris University in 12th century. Then the University of Oxford was there. That was in 12th and 13th century. Then we have Cambridge University again in 13th century. But 700 years before that, all these universities coming up. From 4th century onwards, we had a full-fledged university, a very big university in which almost all the languages were taught. Not only the Indian languages, but even the Chinese was taught, Tibetan language was taught, Burmese was taught. Many of the languages were taught. It was a virtual university itself. So while going through all these things, I mean, it was initially a small attempt made by Lord Buddha. Lord Buddha, he used to stay also there in Nalanda. So Ekam Samayam Bhagava Nalandayam Viharadi Pavari Gambravane. There was a place known as Pavarik in Nalanda where Lord Buddha used to live also whenever he was on the way from Rajgir to Patna, from Patna to Vaishali, from Vaishali to Shravasti. So whenever he was going and coming, he used to stay there. And there he made a small institution In order to fight against this caste system, he did not fight against it directly, but indirectly he fought with it. And also at that time, for Hinduism, for Hindus, it was prohibited to go outside. I mean, they could not cross the sea. But if you cannot cross the sea, that becomes a great impediment for commercial transaction, especially if you wanted to have of the overseas this one works and overseas trade work. That was a great impediment. So he sent so many people to various countries. It was not only India. He even sent so many people to various countries. Especially we know during the time of Ashoka, people were sent to Sri Lanka also, and the kings were converted into Buddhism. So we are going to speak about all these things. And then when it reached 12th century, 1192, that was a watershed mark. Muhammad Ghori captured India or Delhi, whatever you call it. And one of his army men, Bakhtiyar Khilji, he crossed Ganges. He annihilated most of the people there, I mean the monks, and the great university of Nalanda, Vikramshila, they were all completely burnt. And the great institution which had once upon a very big libraries, Ratnaganja, Ratnodati, Ratnasagara, all of them were completely burnt. Mercilessly, the monks were butchered. They had to run away from here. And then Buddhism lingered for some more time. And then we don't hear about Buddhism. Even during the period of Sultanate period, we don't hear about Buddhism during the period of Iltutmish. We don't hear about them during the period of Khaljis. Tughlaqs we don't hear. Even during the Mughal period also, we don't hear about Buddhism. Only Firoz Shah Tughlaq, he had shifted one Ashokan pillar from Topra, that is in Punjab area, from there to his own capital, Firozshah Kotla, but without knowing that this has any association with Buddhism. He did not know about Buddhism also. There were few inscriptions also on them. He brought, he invited many learned Brahmins also to read what is the inscription. Nobody could read it. So we don't hear anything about it. And we completely forgot, in India, we completely forgot that Buddha was from India. We completely forgot that he was from Magadha. Even some of the great biggest scholars of that time, like Irwin, William Jones, he thought perhaps he is an African or he is an Ethiopian. That was, I mean, what he was one of the greatest scholars of that time. Without any kind of unbiased studies, he thought that he is a Ethiopian or he is a Egyptian because some of the sculptures which was excavated from certain places that was having that curly hair. So that curly hair is mostly for the Egyptians or Africans. So many of them thought like that. And some of them thought that Ashoka is not an Indian because in our Puranas, Ashoka is not very much eulogized. He has not been given his place in our Puranas. So people thought that he is, even the great James Prinsep thought that he is a Sri Lankan king. But then the question came, why a Sri Lankan king would, I mean, give an, I mean, who would write an inscription in Indian subcontinent? So that was the another big question. So today we are going to take up how then we came to know that Buddha was an Indian, how we came to know that Ashoka was an Indian, and Buddhism was from this area. So I will take it up systematically on the basis of the slides. So we are going first to the slide of Firozshah Kotla. In Firozshah Kotla, there is a huge pillar. This pillar, it was brought by Firozshah Tughlaq. Hmm? So this is Firozshah Kotla. Firozshah Kotla was the fifth capital of Delhi. Delhi, as we all know, that it had seven capitals. So this was the fifth capital. Firoz Shah Tughlaq from 1358 up to 1588, he saw this pillar without knowing that it is Ashokan pillar, or even about Ashoka also. He did not know anything. He saw it in Punjab. He liked it very much. Then he bought it with great care. He bought it to his capital, that is Firozshah Kotla. There he put it up. So this particular piece was seen by William Finch. Who was William Finch? William Finch was an Englishman. He had come to India during the period of Jahangir in 1611. He was, of course, attracted by this beautiful pillar because it had that Mauryan polish was there. So some people said it is made of steel. Some people said no, it was. I mean, he himself believed that this might have been erected by Alexander the Great. Otherwise, an ordinary king cannot do it. So it might have been made by Alexander King, the king. So that was what he thought of it. Anyhow, after some period of time, then he went from here along with Jahangir. He went to Allahabad Fort. In Allahabad Fort also, there was an equally very beautiful pillar was there. He saw that also. Then he wrote about this one in his own travelogue. Then after some times in ഇതാണോ അല്ല ഇതോ So this is that Allahabad, within Allahabad Fort, there is a pillar like this one, and this is that pillar. Then and there was another Jesuit traveler, Joseph Stephen Taylor. He came to India in 1767. He also saw this one, and then he also saw two other pillars in Bihar. So first one was not in Delhi, that is the Firozshah Kotla one was not in Delhi. It was in Punjab. From Punjab it was brought. This means it is originally it belongs to Punjab. Then there was a similar pillar in Allahabad. Then Joseph Stephen Taylor he saw it another pillar in Bihar, and that too in Bihar he saw it that Loria Araraj and Loria Nandangarh. Both these things, Loria Araraj and Nandangarh also had inscriptions on them. They tried to read the inscription. They could not make anything out of it. And then, so that was in the year 1976, 77. This is Loria Nandangarh. And then we have Loria Araraj. This is Lori Arraj. Lori Arraj has no capital. I'm using the old photograph, not the present photograph. Now all these areas, Loria Nandangarh and Loria Arraj and other places, we have made beautifully. We have made it very beautiful. So there is no problem for it. So sorry again for interruption. Can you hear me? Can you hear? So this was in Allahabad Fort. Allahabad Fort pillar was also exactly the same. Then he went to, I mean, Joseph Stephen Taylor, that was in 1767. He saw two pillars, that was in Bihar, Loria Nandangarh, Loria Ariraj. All these are, I mean, old photographs because, in order to get that authenticity and integrity, I have used only the old photograph. Now all these places have been beautified by Archaeological Survey of India. So a man, who is this man who has planted all these things, and especially right from Punjab, it is coming up to Bihar. And then by 1818, Kandagiri and Udaygiri, that was discovered. So in Kandagiri and Udaygiri also, the same kind of this one, the same kind of inscription. The only difference was it was not on pillar, but it was a rock edit. And the word used by, the letter used by, that was Brahmi script was used. I mean, it was, nobody knew it is whether it is what is there is written, whether it is Brahmi or not. So Udaygiri and Kandagiri is, that is in Orissa. So one is top in the north Punjab, and in Udaygiri you have got the same kind of script. We don't know whether it is Brahmi or whatever it is. Then in Rajasthan also, in Girnar, in 1824, another inscription was discovered. It was also the same kind of thing, because it is the difference between, one is on the western part of India, and Orissa is, that is in the eastern part of India, and the third one, that is in Punjab. So all of them have got the same kind of inscription. So who is this man who has issued an edict like this one? We did not know anything. Then by 1818, 1819, Ajanta and Ellora, they were also discovered. They were also having the same thing. In 1818, Taylor had discovered Sanchi Stupa. That was also having some inscription. I will come to that inscription at a later time. So all of them were having the same kind of inscription. Now the question is, what is inscribed there? What is the meaning of this one, the inscription? Who is the author of this one? What is the content of this one? This was, of course, wrangling in the mind of many historians. Then they tried in their own level best, and nobody knew about Buddhism. And Fahian and Huangsang were not translated also by this period of time. So nobody knew about anything about it. Then there was a scholar known as Christian Lassen. He got some few Greek coins. The advantage of that Greek coin was Bactrian coins, we call it. It had on the obverse, it was in Greek, and then the reverse, it was in this Brahmi script. So on the obverse, it was written Agada close. That was in Greek. And on the reverse also, people thought, historians thought, Lassens thought, Christian Lassen thought, it might be the same thing. And then there was a word Raje. So the king Agadocles. So it was on the obverse, King Agadocles was there in Greek, and on the other side, it was in Brahmi, or on whatever script it is known as at that time. So they got 6, 7 words like this one. Then the second push came from Sanchi Stupa. In Sanchi Stupa, there were near about 21 inscriptions were there. In all these 21 inscription, the first portion was of different things, different names were written. He just presumed that it might be the name. That is, I mean, now the time of Prinsep came, James Prinsep. He just presumed that it is the name of certain persons. And the last 3 words in all these 21, it was the same. So he just presumed again, these are the names of the people. The first portion is the names of the people who had donated. And the last 3 words are Danam. That was gifted by this man, gifted by this man, gifted by this man. So these were the eureka moments of Indian history, and especially our Brahmi script. So Agadocles is, I mean, Raja Agadocles was the first one, and the second portion was Danu. And then, with the help of some Indian scholars also, James Prinsep, he was able to read all of them, and all the inscription, especially from this one also, he was able to read the inscription of the Firoz Shah Kotla. He was able to read the inscriptions of Lori Arera, Nandangarh, and also Udaygiri, Kandagiri, and also Girnar. So he was able to read it. Now, it doesn't speak anything about Buddhism and other things. But then the Bairat inscription, that is near Jaipur, In that, there was a special thing that it was speaking about a Magadha Raja, a Raja of Magadha. It was speaking about a Raja of Magadha and also its association with Buddhism. Because I mean, he is instructing. This Raja is giving certain instruction to Buddhist scholars and Buddhist groups. So that was so here. I mean, they came to know it is in I mean about Buddhism. That is almost in 1840, around 1840, 40, 50, 50. By that time, Fahian was translated into French. Fahian was translated in 1835, but it came. It took some more time to reach it in English. And by 1842, 1843, a portion came up in Hindi or in English also. So Alexander Cunningham, he had come to in India in 1833. He saw this one, so he has a brain click that it could be mostly about India only. So especially there was certain description about Kannauj and also a place known as Sankisa. So he says that if you travel, because I travel from Kannauj, Fahian says 7 yojanas would be roughly about 92 kilometers. So at that time it was again 52 miles. So and I reached a place known as Sankisa where there was a small stupa and also an Ashokan pillar. Ashoka is known as Wu Yu at that time, an Ashokan pillar or Wu Yu pillar. So he traveled from Kannauj towards the northwest and reached a place known as Sangasa. So there he explored the entire area. He could get that mound also. He could also get that pillar about which Fahian had mentioned. Huangsang was not translated at this time. So by that time, he had said to English East India Company that you should appoint a surveyor now. And he tried for that surveyor's post, but he did not get it. That post was given to another man known as Kittu. He was also equally good in that subject. So Kittu, what he did is he went all over the this one Bihar area and discovered many of the places on the basis of the references given by Fahian. Especially, he could discover Rajgir because the description was already given. Many mounds were there. He could discover many other places also, and like Bodh Gaya. But at Bodh Gaya, although he excavated certain portions, he could not realize the real significance of it. In 1835, the great Alexander Cunningham, he had excavated Sarnath, but without realizing that it is a Buddhist stupa. He thought it is something because there was a reference about this one because they had got a relic casket in 1794. A relic casket was excavated from Sarnath stupa. Now the question was why a relic casket in Sarnath stupa? Because mostly Hindus they consign their dead body in Manikarnika Ghat in Benares. From all over the world, people come to that place. But why this man is having it in this place in a stupa, which means he might be a rebel. A rebel means at that time it was either Jainist or Buddhist, but people were not very clear about it also. So that was the reason why Alexander Cunningham had excavated it, but he did not know about its association. But by 1847, with the help of this one, the Fahian, Kittu was able to understand what Alexander Cunningham had excavated was a stupa because I mean he had given Fahian had given a full description about this place in his book. So he was able to understand that it was a Buddhist stupa where from Lord Buddha has started Buddhism. So that it was the beginning of Buddhism was there in Sarnath. So he was able to understand that one. Then a number of other people also started working on this one. And about Ashoka also by this time it was clear, especially on the basis of Mahavamsha and Deepavamsha. Mahavamsha had said that this Priyadarshini, he was a scholar, he was a king of Sri Lanka. But in Deepavamsha, it is said this man is the son of Chandragupta Maurya, grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, and son of Bindusara, and he ruled the country after 218 years of Buddha's death. So that was the biggest point. So on the basis of this, they could understand now all these inscriptions have been issued by Ashoka, who was a king of Magadha, who was the Chakravarti of Magadha. So that, I mean, the history goes like that one. Now let us see the second slide. So here we have got the Orissa, Gajotame, and this was the man who, Major Todd, the man who discovered the Girnar inscription. It was in 1824, but the inscription at that time, there was no photography in 1824 and other place. Photography, of course, was developed in Europe at that time, but it had not reached India. But for getting an eye copy of this one, it took many other. It was in 1835, an eye copy of Girnar inscription was available. But he knew because it looks almost the same thing what they had seen in Kandagiri and what they had seen Allahabad pillar inscription and also what they had seen in other places also. And here we have got the great Princip, the man, because he died at the age of 41, 42, because he tried his level best to understand that Brahmi script and he was very successful also. But still, he did not believe up to 1837. He did not believe that it was Ashoka. I mean, who has issued all these things. But when this one Deepavamsha was translated, and George Turner, he who had translated it. He was working in Sri Lanka, George Turner. He sent this particular portion to Princep. So it was at that time Princep accepted, yes, this man is an Indian man. Otherwise, we were all, the greatest scholars were thinking that all these people are from outside the country and Buddha was an Egyptian and Ashoka was this one Sri Lankan man. And this is how they were issuing the scripts like this one at various places. Of course, we know that this is a rock edict. And this is, of course, from Khalsi. And by that time, inscription from different parts of the world also. For example, we have the biggest inscriptions, the Rosetta table, I mean, in Egypt, that was discovered because that had an advantage. Rosetta had an advantage because it was written in all the hieroglyphics and in Greek also. In Greek and then in hieroglyphic, it was in three languages, so it was easy. And of course, we have this is from Sarnath. We have got the Sarnath Stupa, and Huangsang and Fahian, both of them have written about it, and the inscriptions are here. And this is the list of the inscription we have got. All of you know, the students of history know. I mean, this is available everywhere. So right from the top of India, that is from Afghanistan, Mansehra, Shahbazgadi, Kandahar, and at to Karnataka, Yaragudi, we have it. In 1915, at Maski, Maski means Mahasangika. At Maski, one more inscription was discovered that very clearly says Ashoka Raje, Raja Ashoka and Ashoka Raje. And then at Gujarat, that is near Jhansi, one more inscription was discovered. So that also speaks the name, the real name of Ashoka. Otherwise, it is only Priyadarshini, Priyadarshini, Priyadarshini. Because this Priyadarshini had created a lot of problem. Because most of the people thought that Priyadarshini has a title of a Sri Lanka king. So most of the people thought it might be him. But now the question was, why a Sri Lankan king should make issue such an inscription in India? And is he such a great man that I mean he could conquer the entire country? So these were some of the questions. This, of course, that Behistum inscription. It was also, and very fortunately, this is also in three languages. So it was very easy to for. I mean, of course, it took time. It came. It was only in 1835 Rawlinson could decipher it, and this is the same thing. And you have the Rosetta, and then by that time, of course, as I said that by 640 in 1847, Kittu, when he excavated again excavated in 1835, it was excavated by Alexander Cunningham. But in 1847, realizing that it is a real stupa of Lord Buddha, it was again excavated. At that time, some Buddhist sculptures were recovered from here. So now it is sure it is Buddhist sculptures. And also an inscription known as Vasantapala inscription that was also discovered from this Damek stupa. So which very clearly says he was a king, Vasantapala was the king, and he gives instruction to people that Buddhism you should follow Buddhist religion, and I mean you have to do this puja, you have to do this puja and other thing, and also many other inscription, and especially the Confession of Faith of Buddhism that was also recovered from here. It was on the basis of this. It was now known. It by 1847. It was almost known that Buddhism. It was Buddhist things. Otherwise, we were all thinking it has no connection with Buddhism. And this is another stupa just by the side of it. And I had the privilege of excavating this one. And when we excavated it, we got a structure like this one. This is not an original structure. On the top of it is not an original structure. This was actually made during the time of Akbar, because Todermal he had made this construction in honor of Humayun, because Humayun had passed over this place. At that time, he had made this construction. It's a Mughal structure. And similarly, this the great temple of Mahabodhi. That was also for sometimes some of the people they maintained it, and then the maintenance was, I mean, during the Mughal period and during even earlier the period also, Sultanate period also, there was none to look after it. Then it went to certain Hindu Shiva monks. It went to that place, so there was none to look after it. But always the Sri Lankan people and also the Burmese people, they were always coming from there, and they had a very close relation with this one, and they kept up this feeling that it belongs to Buddha and Buddhism. And even the great Buchanan was coming to, I mean, surveying the whole area. It for him the first information about the Buddhism, because it was in 1811. By that time, the discovery was not made. So it was a Burmese, a man who was converted into Buddhism by a Burmese group, told him that this is actually a Buddhist temple. But at that time, I mean, nobody took him very seriously. And Fahian, of course, was translated by 1842 and 46 also. I mean, 35 it was done to French, then it to English also. So at that time, Fahian did not speak anything about Nalanda, only about a stupa he speaks about it. Otherwise, he doesn't speak anything about Nalanda. So Nalanda was not discovered. In 1811, Hamilton Buchanan, he came to Nalanda. So he asked the local people, what is this? So they said, this might have been perhaps the capital of Bimbisara, because it was huge. He saw huge conical, this one mount, and also some square mounts. So he just could not make out what it was. Only conical, he speaks that only conical mounts were there, and then square patches were there. So later on, we realized that these conical mounds were actually the places of temples, and the square patches they were of the monasteries. So he saw it this like this one, and a man had constructed a house just over this one, because he was away from the village. He was a Chandala. He could not live within the city. I mean, within the village. So he had made a construction like this one, a small house, and he was a shepherd. And this was a very vantage position for him, because he doesn't have to chase his cattle. From here, he can control them. Then it was realized, I mean, his family that increased, so they made one more construction here. So you can see that one more construction was made here. And now, when the first excavation was taken up, because in 1861 and 62, it was now sure that it is the Nalanda, but we did not give any kind of seals from that area. But it was almost sure some inscriptions were there, so on the basis of which Alexander Cunningham identified it as Nalanda. And some sporadic excavations were also taken up. In 1872, the first excavation was taken up, and then later on also the excavations was continued. Now we have to dismantle this house. For the excavation, we have to dismantle this house, and when that was dismantled, you can see here a corner tower. A small corner tower was located. Now, as an archaeologist, we have to go down because now the corner tower is all right, and now we have to go down. And we went down, the whole corner tower came up. The whole corner tower was now exposed, which means this might be a Panchayatana temple of the Gupta period. If it is Panchayatana temple, there will be one more, this one on the second side, third, fourth, there will be four corner towers, and in the center there will be a stupa also. So now what we have to do is we will have to dismantle the house which is written 2. We have to dismantle that also. When that was dismantled, one more tower, corner tower came up. This one. So there were four corner towers like this one, and the central portion that was a stupa. So here also you can see one corner tower, second corner tower, third is on the other side, and fourth is on the other side. Now it is a complete one. But here what you have is it looks like steeple. It's a wrong conservation at some period of time which ASI had taken up because they just wanted to show how many layers were there. But it is, I mean, it gives a very wrong impression. Only a subject man can understand. Otherwise, an ordinary man can not understand what it looks like. So it was actually a stupa. It was a circular one, round one. So here we have walked from this one. It was the from this one. It was, I mean, completely covered with all earth. And then here also, when the family increased, they made one more house over here. For the excavation part, this was dismantled. The house was dismantled. When we went further down, here the whole thing came up, and now you have got two, this one corner towers, and then four corner towers also. And how this might have looked like this is an originally an imaginary reconstruction of it. You have the pillar on one side, second side, third side, and fourth side, and the central portion was like this. It is an imaginary reconstruction made by Percy Brown, and we are also now using this one. So this is how Hamilton had seen it. Hamilton Buchanan had seen it. Some conical towers are there. Some conical mounds are there. What might be inside it, he did not know. But when it was excavated, we knew that all the temples were located on this one. There were 5 temples were there, and on the just opposite side there were square patches, and they were the patches of the monasteries. Here you can see the monastery portion. It is still buried, but from top one can easily understand these are all square patches. And now they have got description also about this one about Nalanda. On the basis of that, it is now very easy that these are on the front side there were temples, and these are the monasteries, and each monastery was 4-storied. And he also speaks, Huang Sang also speaks that there were some 6 stories also, and one was 9-storied. That was, astronomical observatory, Vyoma Nirishanalaya. So now this is, completely buried. It is completely, nobody knows what was it. And then the excavation started. You can see the excavation debris are accumulated here now. And the excavation, of course, it is in progress. Again, it is in progress. It was near about 200, 300 people were employed in every excavation. And many sculptures started coming out. Sculpture of Buddha started coming out, mostly of Gupta period. And you can see the whole site of the excavation, 200, 300, and sometimes even 500 also. And a small train was also used for removing the earth from one place to another place. So now almost one can see the outline of that square patches. One can see very vividly see the patches. And on this side, that conical mound is still there. And what is buried inside? The temples. So the temples were, on all these sides. And now it is half excavated, and there was a well also there. Within each one, there was a well. And this area was the platform where the teacher would be sitting here and the students would be sitting in front of it. And these are the cells, the rooms for the students, and each one of them was 4 storied. And now it's almost clear now. One is completely excavated. The platform for the teacher, the well is there, and also the students could sit here. And still we have not excavated the temples. It is still in the form of a conical mound. And it is of course, 10 years back photograph when I was there. And now we also started the conservation work of it also. And while I was there, most of these are, this Manoti Stupa or votive stupas. If you have got some kind of wishes, you go to that particular temple and then you make a small construction of it, or you engage somebody to make a small stupa, Manoti Stupa. This was in a very bad shape. So we started the conservation work of it. Now everything is completely conserved. Water tightening has been done. And similarly, there were near about 11 monasteries were there. And these are the temple portions. The temple portions, all these temples have been now excavated. All of them might have been near about 200 feet high because, from the base itself, one can calculate most of them were 200 feet high. Whereas this one, that is the monasteries, they were 4 storied. And there was a huge library also on this side, and that was known as Ratnaganja. There were 3 portions: Ratnaganja, Ratnodadi, Ratnasagara. All of them were burnt. And this is the sketch of one particular monastery, and that had hearths also like this one. A well is there. This is the whole thing is the plan, and the entrance portion is this one. And you can see the same thing. And here also you can see the pillars. This was, the base portion was 4 pillar, and this was also completely, the roofing was made here also. And how would you say that, it was multi-story? For that, we have got the staircases here. And Huangsang also very clearly says that it was 4 storied, all of them were 4 storied. So here we have got that staircases are also there. And now when you look at it, it's a fabulous thing. And Huangsang say there were 10,000 students and 1,500 teachers. So it might have been a fabulous university, but it's only half of the university has been excavated. And the rest of the half remains in the villages Now, the government of India should have taken, Archaeological Survey of India should have taken enough precaution. No, I mean to acquire those area. And while I was in charge of it, I had prepared a kind of acquisition formula also. But before executing it, I was transferred. But now, very recently, a portion has been now acquired. The property has been acquired. Now the property goes into 100 acres. But even beyond that, also there is another area that also should be. It is known as Bigampur village. That might have been a very big center. That area also should be excavated by Archaeological Survey of India. First of all, it should be acquired and then excavated. And you had seen it like this one, this is before, and now it looks like this one. The whole work has been carried out by Archaeological Survey of India, superintending archaeologists at various periods of time, right from 1861, 1872, Broadley had done the excavation. Then in 1905, then 1913, then 1935, 1940. Even after this one, independence also excavation was carried out. Now you can just imagine how it looks. Perhaps this might have been the biggest ever excavated university in the whole world. Just look at this picture. Because everything, as you know, look at that earlier photograph, everything was completely buried and the whole thing has been excavated out of it. So I call it the biggest ever excavated university in the world. Nowhere else we can find this like this thing. And we have to have some kind of imaginary reconstruction also, because the whole thing, this has a huge story to say, because Huang Sang, he traveled major five countries. That is, I mean, he started from China. He went to Kyrgyzstan. From Kyrgyzstan he went to Uzbekistan. Then he went to Samarkand, Bukhara, and all these places. Then Afghanistan, India. Then he came to Bangladesh also. He saw all these places. And this was, I mean, he made this tour in the 7th century BC, 7th century AD, only to be a student in this university. Because at that time, in China, India had assumed a kind of mythical proportion. It was looked upon as the Western land at that time. Even during the time of Fahian also, Huangsang also, up to 8th century AD, it was such a mythical land. And people came from all over the world, not only from India, from different parts of India, but also from China, from Afghanistan, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Java, from Sumatra. A Sumatra king, he had give Balaputra Deva, he gave a very big donation to this university, because that this one is there, that seal is there, his inscription is there. He gave a very big this one donation to his university. So that was the importance of it. So such a university, we had such a big past, and that should have been conserved and preserved, and also the land should have been acquired by Archaeological Survey of India. But the problem with the government of India is they might be spending money after, I mean, a huge amount of money for tourism and other places. But the real tourism depends upon this monument. 20% of the GDP is from tourism, and that tourism, 90% of tourism is from heritage monument. And the heritage monuments are never being cared by any government, whichever government you say. We thought that if that government goes, this government will take a lot of interest. It's not like that one. Whichever government comes, the condition of Archaeological Survey of India is very bad. Just see, had it been in any other foreign country, in any other country, they would have marketed it like anything. But we are not marketing our heritage. And this was the great Mallard inscription. And he gives a very beautiful description how the university was looking like at that time. He eulogizes the whole university. And this is not from this place, this is from Vaishali, because he speaks, Huang Sang speaks that there were many images, and even some of the bricks also had they had inlay work. inlay work with the precious stones, and some of the images were also with inlay work. He speaks about it, but we did not get any kind of inlay work from Nalanda, but this is from Vaishali. And for timekeeping, they had this kind of water clock. He gives a very beautiful description about the kind of water clock also, how timing was kept, and how students were studying there. At whenever a bell was struck, people, I mean, the next teacher would come, and from morning up to evening, there will be 100 lectures on each day. That is the description he gives. And this is, of course, a seal which was excavated from there, and Sri Nalandaya Mahavihara, Arya Bhikshu Sanghasya. And even before this one, this is a very, I mean, conclusive proof that this was the Nalanda University. And the emblem of Nalanda University is also there. But even before this one also, there were two other inscriptions which speaks that this was the Nalanda Great University. And the whole, I mean, it is a two-storied, again, a two-storied, this one, monastery. And this was that kind of small train which used to cart mud from, I mean, that is the excavated mud from one place to another place. And a lot of monks, even now, they come there. They take a lot of pride in the whole area. They are, of course, from China, from Tibet, and from various other places. And Huang Sang, as I said, he came, I mean, he covered near about 16,000 kilometers in that area, covering near about five big countries and 110 smaller countries. He came only for this one. And from here, he took 732 volumes of books. And then that was translated into Chinese language. So Chinese teacher, the Chinese emperor Taizong, he made a small request to him, Master, you have made so many translations from Sanskrit to China, and you have enriched our Chinese language. Why don't you? May I request you to translate at least one book of Taoism, that is Laozi, into Sanskrit? But he politely refused. He said that I cannot do that one because that is against my tenets. I just cannot do that. He refused it to the king. Then the king made one more request, you be a minister, my minister in my ministry. He refused that also. That was the greatness of the man. And this was, I mean, while I was there working there, I mean, we had a lot of programs. I mean, I arranged a lot of programs. I mean, the Kar Seva also, because most of the places associated with this, with Buddhism, it was engrossed by a lot of people, but even the great Kumbrahar was also engrossed by some kind of criminal. So I had to organize a number of programs there with the help of the public. Here is Professor R.S. Sharma, the ministry in charge is there. They all came and they did Karseva, and many of the works were completed with the help of the common people and also the press and the channels. We have the great man. And here, there, I mean, from here he went to, of course, China. There he made great monasteries at various places. This is at one place I saw near Nalanda, right, hundreds of this one sculptures like this one. So there, I mean, I had a fear that, I mean, this would be taken over by the smugglers, but it was preserved there because of some other thing, because there was no road to this area. So they could not come with a vehicle. So it was completely preserved in that area. But I just wanted to make it sure. So I spoke to the people. So I gave them a 2000 rupees. That was in 2000. And then there was a Chinese monk which you saw him now, just now. He contributed 10,000 rupees, and then the local people also. So there, just by the side of, I mean, around this Shiva temple, we have made a small village museum like this one. It is just to protect it preliminary, And then once it is, protected there, then I thought that I will shift them to Nalanda, so that in Nalanda we have got a very big museum. So there we can accommodate all of them. So this is the people. You have the people along with you, get their willing cooperation. And some of the this one Bantes, that is the Buddhist priest, also will be with you. And with their help, with the help of the common people, you can rebuild a. So this is the kind of, that is just to protect them. This is the Shiva temple, just to protect them, all the sculptures from these people, from the smugglers. We initially used this thing, and then the second step was to take them to Nalanda. So this is the, we call it the first rural museum. That is, it is, the inauguration is taking place. The Kumbrahar, we had to protect Kumbrahar also. Kumbrahar, as you know, that was the capital of Chandragupta Maurya. Megasthenes has given a very good description about it. So that was the Kumbrahar was the capital of this one Chandragupta Maurya also, Bindusara also, Ashoka also. But the criminals there, they would not allow me to build a boundary wall also around it. But then we again took the help of the intellectuals there, university people, press people, and also the channel people. When they started doing that car seva, all those criminals, they ran away. And then we were able to complete it. So now I think we'll, because this was my plan, and now we'll just go to Vaishali. Vaishali, it was a Vishalam Nagaram, Ramyam, Divyam, Surgomotata. Archaeological Survey of India and the initial Archaeological Survey of India people saw this one, the whole Vaishali, like this one. And from the description of Fahian and Huangsang, it was very clear this is a heritage zone. And for that, you have this pillar, Ashokan pillar is there. So just in front of Ashokan pillar, of course, any archaeologist would tell you that this is, just below this one, there would be a stupa also. And many votive stupas would be there in this area. And this portion, there was a tank. It is known as Markada Hrida tank, because there were certain Markadas, that means some monkeys, staying here. So this was the tank. It is said that it was built by them for Lord Buddha. Of course, if you are making some the monasteries here, then you have to take the mud. So there will be automatically, there will be a tank. So this is a close-up view of this one. And here all around there were houses. They were using this Ashokan pillar for tying their cattle. This is how they were using it. Then when that house was dismantled, a stupa, this was exposed, and then it was later on slowly conserved. And it was said that Buddha had a house also there. Where is that house, and where are the small stupas? So the excavation started. You can see small stupas, that is votive stupas or Manoti stupas. They started coming up like this one. And at the same time, the conservation work is also in progress. And there was a description about a big tank also, that is known as Markadaharada tank. We know the place, and that was slowly excavated. And a number of stupas came up like this one, votive stupas. The big stupa is here, and now the tank is coming up. The water tank is coming up. This was a talab of that area. And these are the steps. Here you can see the steps. And these are the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have this one. And of course, the bark lines are very clear. And now almost the whole thing is exposed. Here we have the the big stupa, and small votive stupas are here. The tank is being exposed. This only one arm is now exposed. And gradually the other portion is also being exposed. And now only the central portion has to be exposed. Now just look at it. What a beautiful excavation. Now the whole thing is now, I mean, you have enough water also. And now the whole area has to be developed. Just compare this photograph on the left side with the right one. Now it looks like this one. Fabulous. Because you have to carry out the conservation work also in tune, and also the whole area, the landscape has also to be developed. It now looks fabulous. Thousands of people are now visiting, not only from India, from all other countries are now coming to see the place, and also individually sometimes, just worship from outside, not from inside, because inside worship we don't allow, and especially in excavated areas. So Archaeological Survey of India has got a rule that at the time of taking over a monument, if it was under worship, if it is under puja, or if it is under namaz, or if it is under prayer, only that would be permitted. If anybody wants to start a prayer at an excavated place, or at a place where the prayer was not there, puja was not there, that would not be permitted. So again, we have got this is from Vaishali itself. You have got that kind of thing about which, Huang Sang had given the description. These are the inlay works. There are many places of birthplace of Amrapali. This is again in a very bad shape. It is in the bazaar huts. We have made small the initial steps in order to acquire this area also, but it is in a, I mean, this one, because this was a Amrapali Vana. This was gifted by Amrapali to Lord Buddha, and Buddha used to stay at this place. So it's a very holy place. Now it is for the government of India, because they had to be very proactive. Archaeological Survey of India, it has no fund, no money. Now the condition of Archaeological Survey of India is very bad. During our period, at least we had some financial power of 25 lakhs of rupees. But now an ASI, the person has got only the financial power of 3 lakhs of rupees. With this 3 lakhs, you cannot do anything at all. It has come, the Archaeological Survey of India has come to a grinding halt during this period, during the last 6 years. And now there was a place where Lord Buddha used to stay. And where is that place? Of course, as an archaeologist, we can say that, I mean, we can just identify this place, this would be that place. And when the excavation was carried out, the clay ceilings saying that it is that the vihara that was excavated, there were many seals like this one, and the house also started coming up where Buddha was used to say. It was known as Kudagar Shala. It was a two-storied house, Kudagar Shala, and Lord Buddha used to stay on the upper side. And now we have to remove this box also. Remove that box. And these two boxes also, we are going to remove it. It was removed. And now some conservation work. The conservation work is going on. Here is that the lower portion, there is a Chandrashila. It was conserved like this initially, and now it looks like this one. And it was on the top of it, Lord Buddha used to say, and there is a Buddhist sculpture was also excavated from this house. And this is that Buddhist sculpture excavated from the house. So that, I mean, exactly pinpoints that it was for Lord Buddha. And you can just compare the old photograph with the after excavation program. And from here, a number of other sculptures in Andhra were also excavated. This is that ladies' monastery because it was after the death of Shuddhodana, his stepmother, she said that I too should be taken into Sangha. But Lord Buddha, he was against taking ladies into Sangha. He said, no, I'm not going to take because if it is, the life of Sangha is 100 years. If ladies comes into it, it would be reduced to half. But she persisted. Then Ananda also, he also influenced Lord Buddha. And ultimately, Lord Buddha accepted her. And this was, it is said by Huangsang also that there was a monastery there. And when we excavated, we got a small room like this one, like this here at this place, a very small room. And here there is a small water tub also for inserting. You can insert this one matka or a pitcher there. What was it? It was, the first attached toilet. First attached latrine was built here in 3rd century, in 4th century BC. It is, again, you can see it here. And the pitcher portion is here for water. And when we excavated further, we got a number of that, this one also, the pan also. The pan which was used in the toilets, that was also excavated from here. Not only from here, in Vaishali, there are a number of places where you can find this kind of pans. And this is our that pan. It is originally we got it like this one, and then some more pieces were also got. So this is that central portion is mainly for the stool, and this is for urine. And this will be on the top of it. So now the site looks like this one. Here you can see this is that Kudagar Shala and the ladies monastery also. And this is that Ashokan pillar and the Ashokan stupa is here. This of course is a sketch of the same thing. And there are many other things in Vaishali. So similarly, what we have spoken about is, so we have almost taken now, I think, almost 1.5 hours now. And now if you have any question about this one, rediscovery of Indian Buddhism, that is our main topic. And there are some more things like that one, but we'll be talking about all this thing on some other occasion. What was the Bairat inscription? What was that Maski inscription? All those things, in detail you can see. You can speak also. You can read also about all this thing. But I just wanted to give a brief introduction about the rediscovery of Buddhism. Similarly, of course, we have the rediscovery of the great Harappan sites also, but I am not an expert on that one. But this I thought, because I had the opportunity to work at various places, not only the excavation part, even the conservation part also, and a lot of interaction with the common people on the basis of which, I could connect many of these things. There are some very good books. One, Ashoka by Charles Allen. He has written a very good book about Ashoka, and this is the best book on Ashoka. And he gives a lot of description how each thing was explored, excavated, and how these great people, starting from William Jones, how they started going into the heart of the history of India, and how they brought out many things which we did not know earlier. Now there is a fashion for many of some of our historians to accuse these people as missionaries. They wanted to say that these people, they had got a hidden agenda. But when we look at the way they had worked, Alexander Cunningham, Kittu, and many of these people, they spend their whole life for rediscovering India. and they have done a great contribution. And accusing these people, I mean, these great scientists with that kind of missionary spirit or with the Christian agents, these are not in the true spirit of an academician. So we have to take much care about this kind of accusations and other things. We have to have a healthy discussions about the contribution made by these great people. So thank you all. Thank you very much. In case you have any any questions about anything, it is time for you to ask it. Thank you very much, and especially once more, Adventures in Archaeology. And for this title, I'm really, thankful to you because this is a very unusual title. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, one is, Mr. Shiv Kumar, where this a merchant donation. I think he might be speaking about this one, Sanchi. Yes, these were mostly because these were all there are a number of merchants were there. These merchants were mainly supporting Buddhism. So these were all merchants' donations. Otherwise, an ordinary man cannot do any kind of any make any donations like this one. It is by Shiv Kumar. Then B.B. Lal's attempt to correlation of archaeology with epic. Of course, that is a very big topic. I think we'll have to have special time because B.B. Lal Sahab's excavation of the great Hastinapura, and again second time at Ramayana site at Ayodhya, and this is a very big topic. We have to have a separate lecture for that one. The great man, he is now 100 years old, and nobody in India has contributed as much as he has contributed. Original contribution for Indian archaeology. And then it is by Majumdar, Sombrita Majumdar. We'll have a special topic for that. Then, this is by Ferotis Satarwala. So, is it true that mainstream India forgot Buddhism during the medieval era? But some sources points out that Muhammad Tughlaq and Aurangzeb had diplomatic relation with Ladakh Buddhists. Is it true? Because I don't think there was any kind of during Muhammad Tughlaq there was no connection with Ladakh. Even with Aurangzeb also, I don't think, because you don't find any mention, neither in Akbarnama, nor in Aine Akbari, nor in Tabqat Nasiri, nor in other things, Muntakhabut Tawari. You don't find any kind of mention. I was also trying to find out some kind of connection. But as you know, that Ibadat Khana was a place where Akbar had invited people from all the religion, Hindu, Muslim, Christians, and then he evolved a new religion known as Dine Ilahi. Even in that group also, Buddhists were not there. Jains were there, Parsis were there, and many other groups were there, but not Buddhist. But the place, I had discovered that place, Ibadat Khana, on the basis of an excavation. It took 2 years. But that structure, this is almost like a stupa, a terrace stupa like this, or a terrace stupa. So I don't know where from that idea came. It might be from Ziggurat, or it might be some Buddhist the stupa which in Bactrian area there was so many Buddhist stupas. So it might be from there that place. Even Akbar's this one Sikandra, that also looks like that of kind of some Buddhist structure. I just can't explain that one. Otherwise, in medieval India there is no reference about Buddhism. Then what can we as normal people do to get the government to give more freedom to archaeologists as an essay? See, Archaeological Survey of India is in a very deplorable condition since the last 6 years. No, during our part, I have worked in Archaeological Survey of India up to 12, up to 12, and we had enough power at that time, so we could do a lot of work. Whatever work I had done in Bateshwar and other places, it is only because of that one. But now there is no power at all. You have to convince the government of India because they are not interested. They speak about the glorious culture, civilization, and everything. But when it comes to the practical field, they don't give any power at all. I have spoken about this issue with some of the biggest people, but even then things are not moving. I don't know why they are not doing it. I am very critical of the government, the present government, as far as the cultural department is concerned. I'm talking about Archaeological Survey of India, not other departments. So I'm very critical of it. So that was from Sri Hari. I don't think there is any other question now. Janambhoomi, Ayodhya, in that discussion, you have supported that places has Ram has born there, Ramayana. And no, I have not supported that Ram was born at Ayodhya and other places. No, I only said that before the masjid, that there was a temple and that a Vishnu temple was there. And from the inscription also, it is very clear because that inscription is there. From that inscription also, it is very clear that uh, uh, an archaeologist will not say that Ram was born here or Gandhiji was born here or Krishna was born here. I mean, he only look at the material evidences. So I did not say that Ram was born at Ayodhya. The only thing I have said is that there was a temple before the mosque. That's all. So this question was, I think, from Manavendra Pundirji. Yes, thank you, Pundirji. So if it is wrong story, I mean, any relationship between Ajivikas and Buddhists, if some evidence, of course, it Ajivikas and Buddhists that way, because there is no evidence. Of course, in Loma Rishi caves, we have got inscriptions about Ajivikas and other things. What can we see as normal people do? Sri Hari, then my question is that whether Panchayatana temples were inspired from the stupa with four corner towers. There could be. There could be because the corner towers are there on four sides, and then we have that the central portion also. There is that is again from Manavendra Pundirji from Aligarh Muslim University, a great scholar. So, any other question? Ayushman Chakravarti sir, what were the sources of patronage for the Nalanda University who made it? Because for Nalanda University, the king, even Harsha had given hundreds of villages. For Taj Mahal, it was 200 villages, but for Harsha during the period of Harsha, and even before that also, huge this one donations were made. So there was no dearth of money for them. Rohan Mathur, what are the reason for the bad condition of the ASI? Because condition of the ASI is again, as I said, I am very critical of it. You have to have some visionary ministers, secretaries, Archaeological Survey of India, Director Generals, then only Archaeological Survey of India will move forward. Now it is in a very deplorable condition since the last 6 years. If it goes like this, when the Archaeological Survey of India will come to a grinding halt. Now, even now, it has come to a grinding halt, and the condition would be even worse. After the destruction of Nalanda, where did the monk flee? Also, which sect of Buddhism did Nalanda patronize? We don't know to which place they have ran away, but there were certain attempts to revive the university, and in 1235 there was one more attempt to revive the university, and some of the students, and there is a student who had come from Tibet. He gives a very brief, very good description also. But even that was also, even when the Khiljis and when the group got the information about it, they made one more attempt to destroy the university. So the description is already there. And Rahul was the teacher at that time. Any relationship between Ajivikas and Buddhists? Now, Ahmad Sharif, why ASI is still following the backdated Wheelerian method of excavation? Of course, there are various methods. Of course, one can, in European countries, they don't follow the bark system. And of course, one can go for that. But this gives you a lot of freedom, because if you have that grid system, and here you have got a lot of freedom to go down below. So that is why most of the people are even now following that Wheelerian method. Ashwini Jole, Sir Vaishali जैसे संबड़ला पसंद इतर टिकाणी. I think it is in Marathi. Perhaps I am not able to give you any answer because I cannot follow. What can do as a young conservation architect in order to conserve the heritage site of our local area? For local areas and development, you have to get the support of the local people also, and also some of the local institutions also. That is very essential. Without that, I mean, you just cannot do any kind of conservation work. But involve the Archaeological Survey of India if they are in a position, or the local government archaeology, because in every state there is a local archaeology is there. You can involve them. I think now it is almost over. So thank you all. Thank you very much for giving a very patient hearing. Thank you very much.